Good day, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. Well, I have two great ultra-portable typewriters here. On your right is the Row of Mercury, and on your left is the Olympia Splendid 33. And because these are two of my favorites in my collection, I thought it would be a great opportunity to compare them and see, is there one in particular that I prefer over the other? Let's compare these two and see. Stay tuned. So the last time we looked at the Row of Mercury, we installed the new JJ Short Platen. I wanted to cover just one other little maintenance issue related to this typewriter before we get into the comparison between the Splendid and the Mercury. I had replaced the ribbon with a new ribbon that was a DIN size spool, one of the ones I buy off Amazon, and it started causing the tops of the capital letters to intermittently be cut off. So this is what the typewriter was doing after I installed the DIN size spool, and intermittently capital letters would be cut off on top. Wouldn't happen all the time. Of course, initially I was thinking, oh, it happens right after a space, and then of course, duh, I realized we generally don't use capital letters except after a space, unless it's a multi-letter acronym. But anyways, yeah, so intermittently cutting off the capital letters, but only with a DIN size spool. And I thought to myself, And then because I knew the problem wasn't present when I used the older original size spools, I compared the DIN size spool here on the bottom with a standard American gauge typewriter spool on the top, and you can see there's a little bit of a difference in diameter. The DIN size spool is about 54 millimeters in diameter, and the American size one is about 49 mils in diameter. So about 5 millimeter difference in size. So then the other thing I started looking at is the shifting action of the Row of Mercury. So some typewriters are segment shift, some are carriage shift, and the Mercury is kind of like the Hermes Rocket and Baby, where it's carriage shift, but it's actually a pivoting carriage shift rather than a full lift of the carriage. So back here is a bolt in the shadows here. That's the pivot point. So it's just raising up the front of the carriage itself. And that means that when you do shift, the ribbon spools are fixed to the main chassis of the typewriter, but the ribbon vibrator pivots upwards with the pivoting action of the carriage itself. And so when you do capital letters like this, the vibrator has to pull the ribbon up at an angle. You notice the angle that the ribbon makes here when it's in the raised position. And so this is my theory of what was happening. So we're going to kind of look at the typewriter horizontally. These are the two spools, not to scale. Here are the hubs of the middle of the spools. Let's assume that these are the DIN size spools initially. They stick out further, the rims of the spool stick out further, and the ribbon has to get lifted like this by the vibrator in the upward position. And what I'm theorizing is the extra diameter of the DIN spools is interfering with the ribbon lift right here. Whereas if it was a smaller diameter, 5 millimeters smaller on the standard size spools, then the ribbon doesn't have this interference point with the spool's rim as much, right? And that's my theory, is that the DIN size spools were kind of causing the ribbon not to raise up quite far enough in the capital position, and therefore cutting off the letters. So the interesting thing about this problem was that the DIN size spool fit the typewriter. The size of the shaft and the hole in the middle of the spool is fine. Nothing was rubbing or interfering with the rotation of the spools. It was just they're a little bit bigger in diameter, and it caused a problem with the ribbon lift as the ribbon bends upwards as the vibrator pulls it up. Interesting little problem, something to keep in mind if you happen to be putting DIN-size spools in a typewriter not designed for it. And oh, by the way, going through my collection of used spools that I get when I buy typewriters from thrift stores, I've found on more than one occasion a typewriter with a DIN-size spool on one side and a non-DIN-size spool on the other. So make sure you check those spool diameters, because that can cause you these weird little problems. Well, the size of the typewriter has a lot to do with how practical it is as an ultra portable, since by definition you want to carry it places. Here you can see the height difference, the Olympia being slightly taller by, I'm measuring it as maybe, 3 or 4 millimeters taller. However, the footprint of the Olympia is less than the Royal Mercury. Here you can see the Royal Mercury is taller, or at least front to back with the case on, is about 10 millimeters longer than the Olympia. But here we can see the SF is a little bit wider than the Mercury, maybe 5 to 7 millimeters wider. I think the most significant dimensional difference, however, is the fact that the Mercury is longer from front to back. Okay, let's weigh both typewriters, shall we? Here is the Royal Mercury, 4,033 grams, or 8 pounds, 14.3 ounces. And the Olympia Splendid 33, 4,197 grams, or 9 pounds, 4 ounces. And now we will weigh each machine with its clamshell case attached. Row of Mercury, 4,701 grams, or 10 pounds, 5.8 ounces. Olympia Splendid 33, with its clamshell lid attached, 4,869 grams, or 10 pounds, 11.8 ounces. As ultra-portable typewriters, you're going to want to carry either of these machines in a shoulder bag or carrying bag, most likely. So just know that the Olympia here on your left is going to be slightly heavier, but the Royal Mercury will be taller as you sit it on its back edge inside of a shoulder bag. It'll need a little bit deeper of a bag, even though it's lighter in weight. Well, small typewriters like these come with intrinsic compromises. So certainly the size and weight is important, because you might be considering taking these somewhere because they are portable. However, there are other compromises that come with small size typewriters, mainly the keyboards. So the question is, how are these keyboards in terms of their size, like the spacing of the keys, which one is wider, which one's narrower? One thing that's really important for me is the distance between the A key and the Shift Lock key. That has a lot to do with how well I can touch type with my especially left hand. How steep do the tiers or rows of keys tier up from the bottom row to the top row? That may have something to do with how comfortable the machine is to type on. So let's measure these and see how they compare. Well, first of all, I'm going to measure the Row of Mercury, the keyboard width, and I'm going to use the middle row, the ASDF row. I'm going to measure from the left side of the A key to the left side of the Cent key, and that'll give you an idea of the spacing. So in millimeters, it's about 189, let's say 190 millimeters from the A key to the Cent key. And on the Olympia, also 190 millimeters. Looks like they're the same width, the same spacing. Now the next comparison is relatively important to me for touch typing. I'm going to measure the spacing between the left edge of the A key and the right edge of the Shift Lock key. I'm going to measure it up at the top surface where my fingers would touch, and it looks to be on the order of about 8 millimeters, maybe 8.2 millimeters on the Royal Mercury. And on the Splendid 33, it is wider at about, take the middle of the key, it's about 11 millimeters, so about 3 millimeters wider on the Olympia, and that kind of corresponds to my typing experience between these two machines. That extra 3 millimeters makes a huge difference for me in how easy it is to type on the Olympia, because my pinky finger on my left hand just doesn't hit that shift key as much as it does on the Royal. So I'm going to measure the height of the key caps on the bottom row versus the top row, measuring to the same standard, which is inside the base of the machine. Then I'll take a difference between them, and this will be kind of the vertical difference between the front row and the back row of keys. And then we'll measure the spacing horizontally between the front and the back row and get an idea for how these rows of keys angle up. So 57 millimeters minus 33 is 24 millimeter rise from front to back on the Mercury. So I'm going to measure the spacing front to back from the front edge, the front top edge of each key row. So starting here on the right on the top row, trying to even that up, and then we'll try to get this adjusted to the front edge of the bottom row, something like about there. And that measures to about 56 millimeters spacing horizontally. On the Splendid 33, 67 millimeters high on the back row, 39 millimeters on the front row, which is 26 millimeters. So it's 2 millimeters taller than on the Mercury. And then on the Splendid 33, I'm going to do the same thing from the front edge of each row of keys, top to bottom, and that is also 56 millimeters. So they have the same horizontal spacing, both machines. Okay, so let's calculate if there's any significant angle difference between these two. So let's see, we'll do the one on the left, which is the Mercury, and that would be 24 enter, 56 divide, and we take the arc tangent, and that is 23.2 degrees, 23.2. Okay, now for the Olympia, so 26 enter, 56 divide, arc tangent is going to be 24.9, so very small difference. So about 1.5 degrees, roughly, steeper slope on the Olympia 33 versus the Royal Mercury. Okay, let's compare the keyboard layouts on both these machines. And by the way, I have the Olympia stacked on the Royal. I should probably do it the other way, but oh well. Don't do this at home, kids. Don't stack your typewriters. Okay, so the biggest difference you're going to notice here is that this particular example of the Splendid 33 is a British keyboard. It has the British pound symbol above the 5, whereas, of course, the Royal Mercury is a standard American keyboard, the $sign above the 4. But other than that, they have very similar features. So for instance, both of them have the backspace key on the upper right corner of the keyboard. They have a margin release key on the upper left corner that also functions as a key de-jammer on both of them. So they also both have a plus and the equals key on the upper right corner and the number 1 key on the left. In the case of the Olympia, it's the shifted one is an asterisk, and on the Royal, the shifted one is an exclamation mark. There are some differences in some of the other key layouts. So for instance, on the Olympia Splendid 33, the shifted 3 is the /, whereas on the Royal, the / is a lowercase down here in the lower right corner. You will notice also, for instance, the % key on the Olympia is going to be the shifted 1/2 key, whereas up here it's a shifted 5 on the Royal. There's a few other differences as well. I think the most notable difference you might notice is the Royal has the pound symbol, or the so-called hashtag symbol, shifted 3. That symbol is missing on the Olympia Splendid 33, just because it's a British keyboard. And then one of the other notable differences, though, you might also notice is the Royal has a touch control and it has a bichrome setting, whereas the Splendid 33 lacks either of those features. You have to go up to the 66 model to get both of those features. And since I have both of these machines stacked, let's measure the width of the space bar. So using inches, it's about 7 1/4, maybe 7 1/4 on the Olympia, and it's about 7 1/8, maybe just about 7 on the Royal. And if you want to measure that in millimeters, you'll be about 185 millimeters for the Olympia and 180 roughly for the Royal. So Olympia has a slightly wider space bar than the Royal. Okay, another difference in these machines is the shifting. They're both carriage shift machines, but as I pointed out earlier, the Mercury has this pivoting action. You're not actually lifting the entire weight of the carriage, just pivoting it backwards, whereas the Olympia, you're definitely lifting the entire carriage, and it does that articulated motion backwards and upwards. The Olympia definitely has a heavier feel to the shift because you are lifting more weight with your finger. Okay, this next comparison is just between the carriages of the two machines. So on the Olympia, you'll notice the paper bale has rubber rollers, and so there is a slight gap between the bale and the surface of the platen, of course, whereas on the Mercury, it lacks rubber rollers, and the paper bale is a flat piece of metal that actually sits right on the platen. So you actually get more complete pressure, at least more consistent pressure from left to right on the platen with its bale. And both of them have a scale, of course. You maybe can't see the scale on the Olympia from this angle, but they both have a scale. But the thing of the Mercury is the scale is closer to the paper, so there might be a little bit more accuracy in terms of knowing where you're at. Another difference I see here is that there's a greater gap on the Olympia between the paper guide on the front here and the surface of the platen. It looks about 2, maybe 3 millimeters gap, whereas on the Mercury, it looks a lot tighter between the paper guide and the platen roller. And, that could be accounted for partly by the fact that the Mercury has a fresh platen from J.J. Short, whereas this is the original platen on the Olympia. But I think when you feed paper into the Mercury, it just feeds a little bit closer to the platen. But because it doesn't have rollers, you do have to raise up the paper bale to get the paper to feed underneath it. The Olympia, however, even though it has rollers, you also still need to lift up the bale to feed the paper because there's enough of a gap here. It's just not going to feed directly underneath the bale on its own. There's also a difference in the margin settings between both machines. So on the Olympia, you have to reach back behind the carriage to get to the adjustment, which is a push and slide adjustment, like a lot of them are. So that's a disadvantage, I think. But the advantage, I think, on the other hand, is that the indicator for the margin sits very closely behind the paper scale. And it's just, to me, it reads more accurately because there's less of a parallax error if you're looking at it from an angle. It's just right there. I really like that. Whereas on the Mercury, on the other hand, it does have the controls for the margin right up front on top, which is easy to get to. But on the other hand, there's a greater distance between the indicator mark and the scale. And so there's more of an opportunity for a parallax error if you're looking at this at a slight angle. Just a little difference, but I really find myself liking this indicator better, even though reaching back to get to it is a little bit less convenient. I should also point out at this point about the paper support finger. On the Olympia, it's a little bit tricky to get to here because it sits in the back like that, and you have to kind of reach your fingernail around, and sometimes it's hard to get to. It's sort of recessed back there, and you have to, if you don't have long fingernails, or like what I just did here is I just pushed it inside the gap. So now you have to get a knife blade or something, a screwdriver, and kind of pry it out. That's a little bit of a problem I've found with this machine. Whereas the paper finger on the Mercury is really pretty easy. You just push this and it raises right up. So paper finger much easier to deploy on the Mercury. So another difference between these machines is the Row of Mercury, when you press the space bar or type a character, it barely moves the carriage on the downstroke, and then the most of the carriage movement is on the release of the key or the space bar. Whereas on the Olympia, it is a half space machine. A press of the space bar or one of the keys, it moves halfway, and then releasing that key or space bar moves the other way. So Olympia is a true half space machine, so you can insert a missing character in a word, whereas the Row of Mercury is not. Both of these machines, however, are half-line spacing machines. So in the single line position, it'll do 2 clicks of the ratchet, 1, 2, and in the middle position it's 3 clicks, 1, 2, 3, or 1.5 lines, and the front position is 4 clicks, 1, 2, 3, 4, or double line spacing. And on the Row of Mercury it's the same way. The back position single line spacing is 1, 2 clicks. Middle position is 3 clicks, 1, 2, 3, or 1.5 lines. Front position is 4 clicks, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 2 lines spacing. The difference is the line spacing variable on the Mercury. It has even in front of the double line spacing. Now this is your variable. And also behind the single line spacing is carriage lock position, like that. The Olympia, on the other hand, if you push it back beyond the single line spacing mode, you get into the variable line spacing mode like that, and its carriage lock is this lever back toward the rear of the carriage. Here you pull forward and then you can lock it like that. And I should point out that the Mercury has a second line spacing variable feature. Again, its main line spacing variable is pulling the line spacing selector all the way to the front, but it also has this second one. If you turn the left platen knob clockwise, you can unscrew it slightly and adjust make a permanent adjustment to the line spacing, and then tighten it back up by turning the knob counterclockwise. You might notice on the Mercury there's a lot of space between the rubber tight bar rest support and the rim of the ribbon spool, whereas on the Olympia there's very little room between the end of the rubber tight bar support and the back tension lever of the ribbon spool. And I've had to push this in and even trim a little bit off to make sure that this doesn't hang up on the back tension lever. The ribbon lift on the Olympia lifts the ribbon from the right side. So there is a pivot point right under the ribbon here. This is the pivot point right there. And so it's pivoting from the right, kind of like the way an Olivetti Lettera has a pivot point from the right. Whereas on the Row of Mercury, its ribbon lift it lifts it from the middle. So the Olympia is on the right, the Mercury is on the left. Keeping in mind the Mercury has a touch adjustment, and I have it set to the highest or most amount of force required. Okay, so I'm going to use the H key on both of these keyboards. The H tie bar is near the middle of its corresponding segment. Okay, so the Mercury feels like the amount of force required is consistent throughout the entire stroke, up until about right here when you start to feel a little bit more tension as the universal bar gets lifted up toward the top. Now the Olympia, on the other hand, it starts out feeling almost as light as the Mercury, but as it gets right about here, you can start to feel more tension, and the tension slowly increases as the tight bar gets closer to the print position. It feels like the Mercury is a little more of a linear force curve, whereas the Olympia kind of increases a little bit as it travels through its range. As I mentioned earlier, the left-hand typing position is real important, how much clearance there is between the A key and the shift lock, because my left pinky tends to kind of hook over a little bit as I type. So on the Olympia, I have plenty of room. I have no problems with hitting the shift lock. I can touch type pretty easily without any interruptions on this machine. Whereas on the Mercury, it has a closer clearance between the two keys, and I do find myself hitting the shift lock. I have to purposefully think about angling my hand over a little bit more to the right when I'm touch typing, just so my finger doesn't tag that shift lock, which causes me to mishit the A key and not get a thorough imprint. So despite the fact that this has a lighter touch, I find the Olympia Splendid 33 to be a better touch typing experience. Okay, I'm going to do a test typing on both these machines, I'll be leaving their ribbon covers off just so you have a little bit more visibility. Oh, by the way, the paper release lever on the Mercury, you push it toward the back to release the paper, whereas on the Olympia, you pull it to the front. Okay, so. Okay, typing test on the Splendid 33, again with the ribbon cover off just so you can see more of the action happening. So the paper release lever is on the side over here. You pull it forward to release the paper. So the Mercury's is a little bit non-standard in terms of the action of it. Pulling it, pushing it back to release just feels a little bit less natural. And let me move the margins so they're closer together. Okay, here we go. And for some reason, to me, it just seems like the Olympia I can type a little faster on, a little easier on. But let's do a typing test. And the typeface on the Olympia. So one of the big differences between these two machines is that the Mercury is a pica typeface, and the line weight of the characters is thinner. So even with a darker ribbon, it sort of appears like a fainter imprint. Whereas the line weight is a little thicker on the Olympia, and the characters are not really elite, they're European, they're metric, so they're somewhere between 10 and 12. Kind of nicely shaped. I really like the typography on the Olympia. They're both okay, actually, but you can see the difference there. And the Olympia does put out a darker imprint. Well, these are two fine little ultra-portable typewriters. There are some differences, however, as we've gone through and seen those differences. You know, it's hard for me to pick a favorite because they are really close. One does something different than the other. Well, first of all, in these two particular samples, of course, the typefaces are different sizes, but you could probably find an Olympia with a pica typeface. I'm pretty positive. Equally so, you'd probably find a Row of Mercury with an elite typeface. So the typeface size is not intrinsic to the model. It's just whichever sample you happen to get. So as far as me and the peculiarities of my typing, and specifically with my left pinky finger and how I touch type by kind of rolling my hand, my left hand more, the Olympia definitely gives me a little more clearance between the A key and the shift lock, and so I find myself making less errors and less misstrikes on the A key when I'm touch typing. And for that reason, I do like the Olympia better, but I also like having the bichrome setting on the Mercury here. I do like typing in two colors. It just is a fun thing to do to add emphasis to a piece you're working on by making certain letters highlighted in red or even underlining them in red. Now, as far as having a touch setting, it's marginal. It's like most machines, right? It does very little effect. It does some effect. So I don't see that as a real advantage, but I do think if it was a closer comparison, really it should be between this one and the Splendid 66, because the 66 model does have the bichrome setting. I just don't happen to have a 66 model available for me. Okay, and then of course I have a new platen on this machine, which definitely has made it quieter. I haven't replaced the rubber on the Olympia, but it actually is in pretty good shape and kind of resilient still. Doesn't really feel like it needs it. Two really good machines. One's a little lighter, but a little slightly bigger. The other one is a little more dense. So it's hard to pick favorites here, really. And so what do you do when you have two kids that are, you know, similar but not alike, not perfectly alike? You love them both. Well, you're going to keep them both, and that's what I plan on doing. You know, it is nice at times to have a pica-sized typeface. For instance, addressing envelopes. I think it's really better to have larger size print on an envelope. Whereas if you're writing compact size pieces, it's nice to have the smaller typeface. You can fit more words on a line. I just like that better also. Another good reason to keep both of them. Well, a little comparison here between two of my currently favorite ultra-portable typewriters in my collection, Row of Mercury, Olympia Splendid 33. I hope you found this informational and helpful. Leave a comment down below. I'd love to talk with you more about these. And also, I encourage you, if you haven't done so already, click the subscribe button and click the like button if you like this video. Well, you guys stay well, stay creative, and have yourselves a great day. Bye-bye for now.